Welcome to Big Closet, Small Planet. I'm Mike Schrager. This podcast is part of a special series for the Scandinavian Textile Initiative for Climate Action Week. So last year, we heard from a number of experts and stakeholders about the global warming's negative impacts on companies, workers, and communities in countries where a majority of global production currently takes place. And a analysis was completed by the guest we have today and his team on these impacts, how they will continue to grow, specifically on perhaps how workers and factories will be affected by global warming, the heat, and what this could mean for the responsibility of the industry to address these impending changes due to climate change. So I wanted to check back in particular with the author of that report, which was Higher Ground, Jason Judd, who's from the Global Labor Institute at Cornell University, and to see what analysis or action has taken place since that report was published and what additional analysis has taken place. So with that and no further ado, I will invite Jason to introduce himself again for us and to remind us what Higher Ground was about.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Jason Judd, and I am the executive director of the Global Labor Institute at Cornell University in New York. Most of our work is focused on quantitative analysis of what's happening to work and workers in global production. And a lot of the work focuses on the apparel industry. We were in the throes of the COVID crisis, trying to think a little further ahead. What would the next crisis look like? And how would the industry respond if it was a slow onset crisis as opposed to a fast onset crisis, one in which you might struggle to see the end of it or understand its impacts? And the climate crisis offers itself. It's a slow-moving, slow onset crisis of the kind that not just national governments and every constituency on the planet, but the apparel industry would struggle to cope with. And as we read about the industry's response to the climate crisis, there was a lot of work being done on decarbonization, and we were interested not so much in the mitigation approach, that is, decarbonization, reducing the industry's greenhouse gas emissions, for example, but in the other end of the problem, what we call adaptation, dealing with the effects being felt right now by workers, their employers, their governments, from extreme heat and intense flooding. So that's what drove us, and we delved into the science and working with Schroders, an asset manager based in London, analyzed or projected what we thought extreme heat and intense flooding would look like and do in places where apparel production is a big deal. And we selected 4 countries to look at closely. They are Bangladesh, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Vietnam. And in this pair of Higher Ground reports, you can see both our macroeconomic analysis, what sort of damage would heat and flooding do in the coming years, the next 5 years, the next 25 years, and a microeconomic analysis. What would that damage do to factory level earnings, to brand and retailer earnings, and ultimately to investors? So that's what we rolled up into that first pair of reports.
And just to again highlight some of the results from that report, you looked at, for instance, sort of temperatures where it would be difficult for workers to be productive, for instance, as I understood it, and how this could lead to less productive work time and therefore, in turn, less productive profits for the actors in the supply chain. Was that one of the logics there?
Yeah, that's right. The real, well, I won't use the term killer. The real, the pain comes from high heat, which is laid on generally. Think of a region like Ho Chi Minh City or Karachi. Uh, there may be occasional flooding, and it may be very dramatic and destructive, but it's relatively isolated. Heat, on the other hand, is laid on all over a region, and it has a profound impact, not just on workers or people as we slow down in high heat and high humidity, but over time has an effect on productivity and output, and ultimately on worker health. So our approach was, whether you're interested in earnings losses, the damage that high heat does to worker productivity and therefore output and therefore earnings, or you're interested in worker health, you've got a reason to act or to counteract the effects of high heat and humidity. And in this pair of reports, we estimated how many days above a high heat or a high heat stress threshold would occur in each of these cities, and then we used that to calculate possible losses. And then briefly at the end of the report, we calculated what a generic intervention, investments to reduce heat around workers and in production areas would cost, and what the return on that investment might be.
And what was the result there? Was it that, with a degree of investment, you can mitigate these losses and improve people's health and well-being, or was there's going to cost a lot to address this? What was the thought there?
The first one, that with a few exceptions where the heat is extremely high and the humidity is high, where the heat stress is so high that a water evaporative cooling system, for example, a relatively low cost intervention, won't bring down the temperature sufficiently. Accepting those handful of cases, those handful of places, a modest investment can reduce the temperature such that worker productivity bounces back, and you can earn back. You can earn back by reducing the temperature what you've been losing to high heat. So the ROI is positive, and it's relatively short. Our sort of back of the envelope calculation was that in most instances, 3, 4, 5 years.
So then we're going to come back to this in terms of how it links to the more recent analysis. But my understanding is then after you release this report, which is available on our website and such for people to look at, you then followed up with an additional report, which you have the theme, one was higher ground. This was called Hot Air, appropriately enough. Good titles. What's the difference between the two reports? What did you focus on in Hot Air, and why is it relevant?
Yeah, well, higher ground was looking ahead. We were using flood and heat models, climate models, to estimate the coming impact. But as we were writing that report, we were reading reports daily of record-setting temperatures almost everywhere on Earth, and certainly in many of the places where apparel production is important. So we wondered, even as we were writing it, do we have this right? Or is the combination of high heat and high humidity in particular, is that combination accelerating faster than the climate models that we're using predict? So we weren't able to do that as we were writing higher ground. So we decided that when this one went in the can, we would look back at the historical data and try to track what we call what's known as the wet bulb globe temperature, this combination of heat and humidity over the last 20 years in 25 or 30 cities where apparel production is important. And again, in those 4 countries that we looked at in higher ground. And we found that in places like Phnom Penh, Ho Chi Minh, Hanoi, Dhaka, etc., that the number of high heat stress days is growing, and that taken together, lumping those four together, you can see that the intensity of heat waves, day after day of high heat, and the length of those heat waves also growing over the last 20 years. So we didn't revisit the original analysis, but it's safe to say that heat stress has been accelerating in these cities, in these regions, and that means our projections for the near future and the long-term future, 2040, 2050, are conservative. That is, they may underestimate the damage that heat and flooding will do in these places, unless there are interventions. All this assumes that the industry does not move assiduously, does not move quickly and efficiently to make the necessary investments to protect workers and production against high heat and flooding. And in our experience, that's a pretty safe assumption.
So your original report may have underestimated the impacts of global warming and climate change in these cities, uh, because you looked at the trends and they're like, this is more intense and more immediate than you initially thought, and you analyzed what this could mean for the industry, and then did you also, as you did a little bit in the first report, did you say, okay, here are our recommendations again, or did you keep the recommendations as they were stated in Higher Ground? Were there new recommendations? I guess I'm asking.
We Well, we repeated them chiefly because the recommendations from Higher Ground had not, we hadn't seen universal uptake in the year or 18 months since we published. Again, that's not surprising. So we reiterated what we'd argued in the first pair of reports in hot air, but we also updated them because we have seen some change. We think we know that investors and brands and retailers and even some manufacturers who read the reports or just know from their experience that high heat and flooding are advancing as threats to production and threats to workers have gotten into gear, a pretty low gear, but gotten into gear. And we've seen, for example, a handful of brands and retailers draft and begin to implement guidance, specific guidance for their manufacturers, for their partners on extreme heat. I'm looking on my desk here is a draft from one of the world's largest apparel brands. Their first effort. We've had conversations with brands in the UK and Europe who have heard from investors, firms like Schroders, who hold a piece of their companies and have been pressing them on what they're doing in response to our analysis. What are they doing to address? What are they doing on the climate adaptation front? And they're beginning to move. So I'd say it's slow and it's painful, but it's beginning to pick up a little bit of speed.
Because I had a sense that you did a bit of a tour, right, after you did the report, and you did naturally try to introduce this information to as many stakeholders, including brands and retailers, as possible. And so I hear from you saying some took it in and said, let's come up with some initial ideas, which you've just related to, but maybe it wasn't sort of acted on as at the scale and pace that you thought it would, or are you happy with its movement right now in terms of the understanding of this?
Well, hard to say we're happy. We'd like
terrible word,
to see all of these players moving faster. They have built the brands and retailers have built over 30 years a whole machinery of private regulation to set standards and drive change amongst their suppliers to meet a new standard. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's done in good faith, sometimes it's not. So we want to see that machinery put to work on this issue. It's a good fit. Whether your interest is worker health, or it's protecting worker productivity and output, you've got a reason to figure this out and make these investments. What we had hoped, we still hold out some hope, that regulation, which sort of raises the floor for everyone. So it's not a question of private voluntary programs, but mandatory industry-wide standards would follow with the implementation of CSDDD, the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. It would because it includes worker health among the things that these lead firms should be paying attention to. It would, in theory, drive the lead firms to ask questions of their manufacturers, their tier one suppliers, for example, about the effects of high heat and humidity on worker health. And that if the lead firm was not asking those questions, they would face a civil liability, a legal liability under CSDDD, because these are questions they should be asking or not, but aren't, or they're asking and they're getting insufficient data, or there's evidence that high heat is not being dealt with at the factory level, and workers are suffering. There are harms, and the lead firm is doing nothing about it. So in either instance, the lead firm can be expected to act on this problem, to start to deal with climate adaptation. But as you probably know, the CSDDD legislation and CSRD, the reporting directive that goes along with it, are being reworked, deeply discounted at the European Commission. So we're not sure at this point if that connection between the behavior of the lead firm and the impacts on workers is intact. We think it is. We hope it is. We're going to wait for the omnibus to roll over, and we'll see what's left in the road.
The omnibus to roll over. So what I'm getting from you is, which is what I wanted to ask. It's not clear to me that governments, brands, retailers, other stakeholders, unions are, maybe the word is, that prepared for helping with adaptation. Is that what you're saying? They've read this report, or it's getting some play, but how well prepared are these actors who influence the textile industry to address this issue of adaptation, given your now year and a half or more of introducing this analysis and engaging with these stakeholders?
Yeah, I'd separate their response into two parts. One, the technical, and the other, political. On the technical side, it's not hard for these firms to figure this out. They are for the most part, sophisticated global operators. So they can command the expertise they need to set a standard, and they can track it at the factory level, and they can police heat thresholds, for example. And the private regulation machinery they've built over 30 years is that's its point, that's its purpose from their perspective. So technically, not a problem, but most of these problems are not at their core technical. They're political. They're problems of power, and the lead firm does not want to recognize an obligation to deal with this quote new problem. So they're reluctant to take it up. And their partners, the manufacturers, also reluctant, because they see this as a looming mandate, another unfunded mandate that their buyers are going to impose on them. And they don't want to bear this new cost, because they assume, often rightly, that the price they get for the product won't reflect this new higher cost. So both parties have reason to stand back and wait.
And so you were hoping that the at least the EU due diligence legislation would step in and require this of actors.
Yeah, that's right. And it sorry, I'm cutting you off, but I was going to throw in one more thought. That one of the upsides of a standard, a mandatory global or EU-wide standard for lead firms would require, among other things, that these companies, these lead firms, and their suppliers abide by national law first. And in some places, Vietnam's a good example. Thailand, Malaysia, Nicaragua, there are others, already have clear heat thresholds in national law, but they're widely ignored, both by the national governments themselves and by the manufacturers and by the lead firms. And CSDDD would we think require lead firms to pay attention to this and to require that their manufacturers abide by national law first, or face a legal liability. But that's all. That's all.
Up
That's
in
all
the air
nice.
right now. Yeah, exactly. Okay. There are often principles and terms used in this area, and one of them that's been used a lot is this idea of a just transition. And we talked about it last year as part of the framing for our discussion during Climate Week, Action Week last year. But I'm curious, given that you're working with very specific things, specific analysis, specific impacts on workers and factories. Uh, how do you define a just transition? Uh, what does it mean in practice to you, given the work you're doing, and how do we operationalize it? Because when we try to take the sort of high level principles in our work and say to the companies we're holding accountable, you need to do this, and to the stakeholders, you need to do this, we often find the sort of support on terms of how to take certain actions and when is not so clear at this point. So how do you define and think we should operationalize this topic of this principle of just transition?
Yeah. Well, just transition, in its original sense, means or meant a decarbonized economy, and argued that the transition from a fossil fuel based economy to one that relies on renewables and radically reduces greenhouse gas emissions, that transition would be painful, would entail huge costs, and that transition should be just. That is, it should take account of the impacts that the transition will have on an economy's or a society's working class. And the term has since been much abused. It's now applied to almost everything. You can probably buy a just transition latte at a Starbucks.
Can you?
I just made that up, but I'm going to
Okay,
go look when we're done.
I get your point.
Yeah, but other terms have been abused in a similar way. Corporate accountability is now widely used and has lost all of its punch. Social responsibility. I mean, this happens. So we've largely left that term alone. We don't employ it much, and we talk in specific terms about the impacts that climate breakdown is having, and we expect it to have on workers and their families. And we refer to that as climate adaptation, to distinguish it from climate mitigation, which is chiefly about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the way to some sort of efficiency here is to put the two together. So we could use just transition to refer to both mitigation and adaptation, and it's probably not worth having an 8-year argument about the terminology. We need at the factory level manufacturers to be thinking about and investing in both at the same time. So even as they're attempting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they are also figuring out how to make adaptive investments to protect workers against extreme heat and intense flooding. And these two, you could argue that they work against each other, that if you're cooling a factory, if you're cooling a vast production area using an air conditioning system, that's A, very expensive, but B, also running up your energy usage, running up your carbon numbers. and therefore discouraged by your buyer who wants to see greenhouse gas emissions reduced. So firms are going to have to figure out how to do both of these at the same time, and we're beginning to do work in Bangladesh and other places to see how the numbers work. How is it possible to do both at the same time and get a positive return on investment? Now we're not sure that there's an easy answer to that, but we're gonna run the numbers, and we know that there are suppliers around the world who are doing this, who are reducing greenhouse gas emissions and are effectively protecting workers against high heat.
Do you have any view on a more extreme situation where a buyer is saying, I can't reduce my emissions at the pace and scale I need if I'm still buying from this particular region or country or factory, and therefore I'm going to move to another country or factory to source my products, which in turn, at some level, puts the workers and communities who previously have been doing the production at risk? Is there any view you have of that situation?
Uh, we think it's. I mean, there may be a couple of exceptions, but we think on the whole, this is a problem that the industry can deal with if it turns its talent and its treasure to the problem. I think the standout in our analysis is probably Karachi or Pakistan more generally. The heat and humidity figures are impressive, oppressive, and it may be that in manufacturing there, in order to bring down the temperature to safe levels, they will have to invest in refrigerant air conditioning systems, and those will have to be super efficient if they're going to both cool the workplace and reduce overall GHG numbers.
So then, where do we go from here? You've done two very, very substantial analyses over the past, is it 2 years?
Yeah.
And you've began to educate the industry and its stakeholders on this particular issue of adaptation. And you've had some, I would say, success in at least getting maybe the first movers and the most maybe progressive actors to start to work with this additional area of action. What's your hope now moving forward? What do you want to see in the next year and the next 3 years?
We're going to start work very soon in Bangladesh with a handful of brands and retailers and a handful of their manufacturers, their suppliers, to begin to track heat and humidity levels and integrate those with productivity, with output data, to be able to demonstrate to the GM in these factories the relationship between high heat, humidity, and their earnings, and thereby make the case that adaptive investments to cool the workplace, for example, are smart investments. That's relatively straightforward. That I'd class that as a technical problem. Uh, the the larger long term problem is still political. How do we get governments to enforce standards that they've already written or introduce meaningful standards and enforce them? How do we preserve this connection between lead firms and harms to workers in the due diligence legislation? That's a goal, one we share with lots of other groups. How do the multi-stakeholder initiatives, which are charged with solving problems like this, made to do their jobs? I can't think offhand of an apparel MSI that has drafted or implemented a heat standard. Now, I could be wrong, and there may be a few in the offing, but they've been slow off the mark. And the other big political problem here is old and very familiar. How do we help workers protect? How do we help workers protect themselves against climate breakdown? It's one thing to cool a factory or to protect it against flood damage. It's another to do that for and with workers and unions away from work. I mean, much of the damage to workers and their families is done at home, that are poorly ventilated, or where electricity cuts out during the night, or or costs are so high to cool an apartment overnight that they're pawning household goods to get through the hottest months. The answers to those problems are uh, well, they'll be familiar to everyone listening. Workers need higher wages in order to stay ahead of this climate breakdown curve. They need the right to organize and bargain so they can take up these questions, the workplace questions, but also the home questions. And again, this goes to wages. The most important adaptive technology from workers' perspective. I'd argue there are two. One is cash, and the other is the right to organize and bargain to solve these problems for themselves at the factory and at the industry level. And then the third here in this is the last of the political problems: social protection systems at the national level that that address directly climate breakdown and ensure that workers are not risking their health when extreme heat or intense flooding befall them, because they're compensated for the expected losses. Those three things: FOA, freedom of association, living wages, and social protection. These are very familiar problems to people who work in the apparel industry or global production generally. And the climate crisis gives us one more reason, and a big one, an obvious one, to address them, to take them up.
Okay. So I have to ask you one last question because it's so relevant on the tip of our tongues now, I'm guessing. As we record this, we have a new tariff regime. I don't know if that is the appropriate term from the United States, which seems to be at first glance uh, really hard hitting some of what we would consider the production regions or countries that provide a lot of production for the global apparel industry. And so I just want to take your temperature. I know it's new. There's probably a lot of information that we don't know, but do you see this as a hindrance to our ability to do what you've just said?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I'd call it a tariff tantrum, but that doesn't really capture the damage done, the damage we've already seen over the last week, and the damage we expect in the months to come. Places like Cambodia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, a dozen others that have a deep dependence on export-led growth, and the apparel industry in particular are getting hit with tariffs of 30 and 40% and higher. And it's not clear how the math works. It's not clear how they might negotiate agreements with the Trump people. The way out is not obvious, but the impact for workers, for costs, are seem to be pretty clear. If these aren't rowed back and quickly, then I think orders will start to fall in these places, and that'll mean furloughs, that'll mean job losses, that'll mean pressure on families, but also on the social protection systems designed to protect them. We went through something similar in the early months of COVID. I hope it's not going to happen on that scale, but this is a period of real uncertainty. And when you introduce I'm not introducing a new problem here, but when you bring evidence that there are harms to workers from extreme heat, for example, and it's a quote new problem, uh, all the players, investors, brands and retailers, manufacturers, the governments that are tied to them, they will be reluctant to take up quote new problems because they promise new costs or complications. And when orders are falling and margins are shrinking and workers are losing their jobs, um, these sorts of things move to the back seat.
So I don't know by the time this pod is published what we will see in terms of tariffs. As you know, it's very unpredictable. But thank you for reflecting on that and its potential consequences. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much for your important work, Jason. And we hope to stay in touch so we can see how this particular area of work is evolving and making progress. So thanks
Yeah.
again.
Well, yeah. Thanks, Mike.